Welcome back. Anglican Archbishop Thabo Makgoba says the number of people who've died at the hands of law enforcers in South Africa during lockdown is shocking. Today, he led religious leaders in a silent vigil outside of St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town in solidarity with victims. Black Lives Matter demonstrations have been taking place around the world since the death of an unarmed black American, George Floyd, at the hands of white policemen. Makgoba says it's shocking that soldiers implicated in the killing of Collins Khoza here at home have been exonerated by the SANDF. He says President Cyril Ramaphosa's plea to both police and the military to protect communities fell on deaf ears. Archbishop Makgoba read the names of those who died, including 55-year-old Patrick Michels, who died in Ravensmead, Cape Town, and 44-year-old Sbusiso Amos, who died in Ekurhuleni. So looking at the global picture, thousands of people around the world have rallied in solidarity with anti-racism protests in the United States following, as we mentioned, the police killing of George Floyd on May the 25th. Floyd, an unarmed black man, was pinned to the ground by a white officer in Minneapolis. The officer, who has since been fined and charged for murder, knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes as Floyd pleaded in the now oft famous phrase, "I can't breathe." Protests, which began in Minneapolis, have spread to hundreds of cities across the U.S. and other parts of continents worldwide. To talk more about this, Professor Mojubaolu Olufunke Okome is a professor of political science, African and women's studies, as well as author and editor of Ìrìnkèrindò, a journal of African migration. A very good evening to you, Professor, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Earlier on, I was speaking to an immunologist and saying to her, should there be concern about the spread of the coronavirus? But we know we're dealing with another virus. There have been worldwide protests about this, pledges of solidarity following George Floyd's death. So there are many hashtags, even theme songs. One I'll even channel right now of Sam Cooke, who's been played a lot, saying, can we say a change is gonna come this time around?
I think we should hope, because I think of hope as encouraging as well as being the weapon of the powerless. And in the United States, non-white people are powerless. And the fact that Black people in this country, African Americans, have suffered over 400 years of oppression, and that in spite of the successes of the civil rights movement, that we are still in the situation where we have to say Black Lives Matter, means that there's a resistance to change in this country. And so, yes, just like with the civil rights movement, when Sam Cooke wrote that song and sang it, a change is gonna come. We have to keep that hope, because it would encourage us to be tenacious in the struggle against white supremacy and against oppression and against inequality, and also against police brutality and, especially the targeting of Black and brown people in this country. So this...
Professor, we've seen so many different responses, though, and I'm wondering about the importance of this and how should we be framing this solidarity that we're seeing worldwide? If we're going to really look at the genesis of the problem the world over, that of discrimination, oppression, and otherness.
I think that regardless of where one is in the world, any person of good conscience would see that there is oppression. So here in the US, it's race. There's also economic issues, and there are social kinds of oppression. So if we look at the African continent, we can see ethnicity and economic inequality. And right now, we're in the moment of all being afflicted by this pandemic, coronavirus. And we can also see ways in which economic circumstances of people, and maybe in this country, United States, and also in the UK, you see race playing into people's life chances. So I think this gives us an opportunity to protest and to struggle collectively against inequality. Economic inequality has been part of the neoliberal world order that's been in place since the end of the Second World War. And this has affected populations in Africa, in the global south, more, I think, more harshly than in the global north. So we should fight also to end economic inequality,
What
to
is the root
ensure
of
that
that?
we all also complain and insist that all oppression and inequality ends wherever those phenomena raise their ugly heads in the world.
I want to
So
know,
this
what
has
is the
been
root
such-
of that racial discrimination, the onslaught of racial violence on migrated people, and what the role of globalization is?
Well, I think white supremacy is something that has been part of the evolution of the world system. And this is also white supremacy enables for the otherization of non-white people and for their exploitation and for their dehumanization. Non-white people are the ones who have been enslaved the longest, whose labor have been taken unfairly. And then, whether you're thinking of slavery as forced migration, which is really problematic because it's beyond forced migration, or you are thinking of the ways in which economic inequality and degradation leads to people fleeing from their home countries and wanting to have better economic opportunities elsewhere, and then they are criminalized. Immigration or the politics of migration has been in favor of, let's say, the 1% in the world, and then against the 90%, 99%. Now, when you look at the global north-south, most of the economic impact for migration has been coming from the global south. This kind of migration is not welcome. When you see migration coming from the global north, you see more welcoming policies, more consideration of human rights, and so forth. So again, there's a lot of hypocrisy because a lot of the principles of freedom and equality and equity that we espouse as a world in the liberal order that was established after the Second World War, we are not holding to them. We're practicing segregation. We're practicing the unequal application of the laws and unequal protection of the laws. And we think it's legitimate to brutalize, to authorize, to exploit people who are really from the global south, especially when they are dark skinned. And then that we should have better consideration for people who are light skinned. This is a result of the fact that white supremacy has taken hold in the world as an ideology that people either explicitly or implicitly subscribe to. So you see this happen in terms of the kinds of migration that we think are legitimate, the kinds of migrants that we think are welcome, and the ways in which we just treat people well. And
Professor,
then,
allow me to jump in before we run out of time,
yeah.
because you, in one of the papers that you wrote, you spoke about globalization and its antinomies, or at least its contradictions. And I'd like to use the US and South Africa to juxtapose, some of the trends and why there are those antinomies.
The antinomies, I think, are there because, human beings seem to have a need to categorize. And they would think about, let's just think about a binary. The binary frame works very well because people think of them, us, and then the other. Whoever thought of as us would be treated well. Whoever is authorized would be treated badly. Antinomies are this kind of processes that have opposite effects simultaneously. So for the people who are seen as us, they would be given all the rights of citizenship and then consideration that humanizes them. Those who are thought of as the others are dehumanized and brutalized. And this is thought of as normal, as justice, and as okay. Everybody buys into it because it's the construction by the powerful interests, the elites, about how the world ought to work. And the laws, the institutions, the practices, administrative rules, they all follow this logic that those who are not us should not have the same considerations as us. So you see nativism, if you are native born, then you are entitled to advantages that those who are not native born should not have. But even if you are native born and you are non-white in this country, and I would dare say still in South Africa, you don't have the same rights of citizenship. You have to fight and claim them instead of them being given to you as your right. So you also see this happen with xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. People who are thought of as foreign are not only foreign because they're coming from foreign countries, but there are some foreign countries that are believed to be acceptable. And you see the Europeans doing this because they talk about, they want the EU to be formed of people who have the same cultural experiences and so forth. So there are Europeans who are also not brought into this fold. And it's because of inequalities that exist in Europe. But let's stick to the United States. Non-white people have not conventionally been given the same rights in terms of the ability to migrate into this country. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act in the I think it's the 19th century, and that Exclusion Act ensured that non-white people, Chinese, Japanese, Black people, were not able to come into this country.
I need to ask this as a final question, Professor. You're obviously pointing to a disease that is endemic, and one wonders why we've not learned the lesson. If we look at all of these countries then that host, migratory populations. So have the trends, the nature, the forms, the process changed over time, or are we still dealing with the same in terms of population movements?
There are a few changes. I think it's economic. It's easier to exploit people who are criminalized and said to be illegal. It's more acceptable and palatable to the general public when you say that you are keeping away people who are coming to commit crimes and who are bad people in general, who have bad moral values and so forth. So, and then the economic factor, the fact that no country today can afford to do without immigrant labor. If you allow the immigrants to have equal rights, and they can collectively bargain, and they can have all the consideration that you extend to citizens, some people are going to lose money. They're not going to make as much profit. So, there's the combination of racism and then economic, I think, greed, that combine together to drive this resistance to allowing for people who have struggled and struggled for equal rights to have them. So I think of it as economic. I think of it as social. I also think, the political power that moneyed people have, that the elites have, they're using to ensure that they keep their dominant position. And
so
this,
much, Professor.
I think, contributes to the resistance.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but really appreciate that you situating it in various forms and expanding on those dynamics, especially for people we've seen all over the world trying to pledge solidarity. Where do you fit in? And does it resonate with those that you are saying you're pledging your support to? Thank you so much, Professor Mojubaolu Olufunke Okome, political science, African and Women's Studies professor, as well as author and editor of Ìrìnkèrindò, a journal of African migration.